lived in. What's that?
I started recording.
Oh, okay. Burien. How many of you live in SeaTac? Okay. How many have lived in Tukwila? Not so much, right? How about Kent? How about Auburn? Right? So those are most of the communities, actually even Federal Way, anybody live in Federal Way?
I don't know.
So we got some Federal Way. Yeah.
Oh.
Those are the communities that are most impacted by airport pollution. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. My name is Kent Palosaari. I was a resident of SeaTac for 14 years. I moved to a place with healthier air down near Edgewood. And the principal reason was because I was experiencing health problems and living next to the airport for that many years. That and the fact that I had 2 young children who will also be talking about the effects this has on children especially. I didn't want them to grow up in that environment. I've become an activist out of necessity. And my goal is to educate you guys, and I have a couple other really qualified people. Debbie Wagner is going to be speaking. She was a resident of Burien for I don't know how many years. And then Elena Austin from the University of Washington, who's done a lot of research and been a great advocate for the communities down here. Woody, would you be ready to?
You want to show the video?
Yeah. So a couple of years ago, actually, Elena and Debbie helped me put together an international summit on airport communities and looking at what kinds of solutions to be done to help mitigate some of the problems that arise living next to the airport. And so this was a video that I had put together with my young son at the time, Ty, and also my daughter, Mira. All right. So we don't have any
Here, coming from something.
yeah, can you go from the beginning or?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
That's well enough. This is where we had a community garden 2 years ago that my daughter just truly enjoyed. We had to leave this garden. We had to stop growing plants here because we discovered that the fruits and vegetables were full of toxins. They were full of heavy metals that were not good for people to ingest. People who live around the airport live on the average 12 years less than the national average. Emissions affect children 5 times greater than adults because of their metabolism. During this time when their bodies are forming, they are getting toxins into their bodies that will show up later in their lives in cancer, autoimmune diseases, lung disorders, and heart disorders, as well as reduced cognitive and executive functioning.
In the 1990s, it was very important to me to start to get emissions included into this discussions about aviation impacts, which only focused on noise at the time. Aviation noise has cardiovascular effects, So do many of the emissions that are coming from aviation sources. They also both have metabolic effects. They both have effects on the immune system in response to the toxics and the noise.
I can move, and I am going to be moving. My concern is for all the other people who can't. We are here today to look for solutions. We are not going to be victims. We are activated, motivated. We are going to make a difference. We need your help. We need to work with you to come up with solutions for all communities around the airport.
Probably about 35.
About 35?
Yeah.
All right. So,
92.
so here you go.
33. Sorry, 33 years. Okay, so I've been an activist and my primary focus has been aviation emissions. And I investigated this because I lived in the area that had overflights over my home. And I started to notice effects on my property, on my plants, on my animals, on our health. So I wanted to know what was happening, whether there was something else besides the noise that was causing a big environmental impact. So I was digging into the history of this, and this is back in the early 90s. So there wasn't much information on emissions. The focus from Congress and legislation had been on noise, and nobody had really delved into the emissions. So there was very little information available. So it took a lot of investigative work, and it turned out to be a big mystery that was difficult to unravel and even more difficult to relay back to people what was going on. But I found it very interesting. This PowerPoint will be available. So a lot of this narrative is about the history of what was being said. Like, you moved here, you knew there was an airport. So kind of like you get what you deserve. Sleepless nights, health problems, not able to use your yards. So this is what the airport looked like in 1949. It was surrounded by farms and homes, and it was also actually very heavily populated in relationship to Seattle and the state, because this was a bedroom community for Seattle. The school district here was one of the largest in the state in 1933, and a lot of that has changed over time. So 1970s, there was another runway built. The airport expanded into people. And in fact, the airport was right next door to very dense communities. And the people that lived there started to complain about the noise and the soot that they were seeing on their laundry that they were hanging outside. They were finding black speckled particles on all their clothing. So due to this kind of large complaint going on from people near the airport, Department of Commerce looked at where the soot deposition was happening. And it's a 12-mile area from each runway in. It fans out as far as Bellevue and on the south, Auburn. You can see that this is an hourglass shape. And the smaller hourglass circle, the first one, is the impact at ground level on takeoffs. The larger area is the impact at ground level on landings. So 1970, the state of Washington knew this about soot deposits. UW eventually confirmed this, but no further study happened as a result of this first look at where the soot deposition was happening. It would be 21 years before this was further investigated. I've lost the ability to move forward. Next, ding. Okay. Thank you. So I've already covered a lot of this, but in 1973, as a result of this problem with the soot, and people could smell noxious odors who lived by the airport, they started complaining. So King County decided to do the first monitoring study of air toxics and other criteria pollutants, or those that contribute to the formation of certain criteria pollutants. So they had a monitoring van that sat in a council member's driveway. And these studies were done over a period of months in different conditions. The emissions were so bad and so high, they were surprised. The council member was scared. He quickly sold his house and moved away. Within 3 months of the study, he was gone. And they recommended, this is important because they recommended don't put any more polluting industry around the airport, including even a gas station, because it's too high already and it's expected to cause illness. So in 1991, we have a major study that was done by Department of Ecology. Again, the state involved. So you see the state first involved in 1970, state is involved in 1991, and King County was involved in 1973. This air quality analysis was done by modeling, not actual monitors on the ground. And they used the airport's own model. And what they found was very scary levels of a lot of criteria pollutants. Again, those are what's regulated by EPA. But they also found, with a closer look at the volatile organic compounds, that there were a number of pollutants that were exceeding the state levels. So if you were to open up a smokestack, there are regulations about how much you can release. Some of the releases of dangerous cancer-causing chemicals were as much as 50 times higher than what the state would allow for any industry. So in essence, if SeaTac were a smokestack, it'd never be permitted for operation, but the airport is exempted from these rules. So since the first recommendations in 1973 to not add any more pollution in the airshed, the actual operations of aircraft had doubled by 1991. Alarmed by what people had learned by the public disclosure of emissions from the state, people demanded that the air toxics be looked at more closely. So in 1993, the Port of Seattle actually hired a consultant, McCulley Frickin Gilman, to look more closely at the air toxics. And benzene had been predicted to be a real troublesome item in the array of different air toxics. But there were some that weren't tested for, and others were found to be above levels that the state would allow for new sources of emissions. 1,3-butadiene, interestingly, this is just one of the pollutants in the range of about 100 they could be looking at. was the largest cancer risk increase emission in a similar study in 93 by EPA consultant in Chicago's Midway Airport. So that was not analyzed here in this particular study, but cancer risk was still high. It would have been much higher if they had gathered information on all the emissions I'm concerned. There's a really bad one, PAH, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which has been looked at around airports, found to be very high and expected to cause a health risk. So this is an internal email about the current narrative going on at the Port of Seattle regarding another major expansion they're planning at the airport. This is kind of interesting because this was a Freedom of Information Act request or a public records request through the Port of Seattle to get internal emails and documents about what are they thinking on how closely are they going to look at this emission issue, which has been put off and put off and put off since 1970. So they say, you know, if you want to put in language about airport growth, we could help with some edits, but our planning is not going to address most aircraft emissions. I've highlighted a couple of statements. These weren't meant to be seen by the public. So 1995, the Port of Seattle was planning a third runway. Puget Sound Clean Air Agency asked them to do a risk analysis based on the study that was done at Chicago Midway Airport. In the end, the Port of Seattle did not do that. So they did not look at risk in relationship to the air toxics. But EPA discovered an admission in their environmental impact statement that there would be Clean Air Act violations if they built the third runway. So they stopped the process, and that was temporary. Unfortunately, it went forward and it was certified under issues and conditions that were never verified. Oh, government, there you go. So in 1998, the state of Washington began a health investigation into incidents of conditions around SeaTac Airport, primarily focused on what a lot of community members felt was an extremely high number of deaths from glioblastoma brain tumors. And the trigger on that was that a husband and wife both died of that same brain tumor within a couple years of each other, and they both lived just to the northeast of the airport in Riverton Heights. What the state of Washington found was a much higher incidence of a wide range of cancers, including brain cancer, oral, pharyngeal cancer cases, deaths from lung cancer, COPD, and they looked at these from approximately 3 miles to the west, north, and 1 mile to the east, found these significant statistics. So they wrote a report that said, we need a really thorough air quality study around SeaTac Airport. What is that, the third or fourth time that they would investigate further? No study has been done. It was even written up by Department of Ecology, but that was in 2001, and we had 9/11, so everything has been stalled. It's still stalled. After years of delay and lawsuits, the third runway opened. Now we've essentially tripled the operations from the first time that the state of Washington said this should be looked at more closely. 2014, 2015, airport emissions between 2014 and 2017 more than doubled. So an interesting thing in the environmental impact statement from 1996, the Port of Seattle claimed that there would be approximately 5,000 tons of emissions at SeaTac Airport. Actual figure for 2017 was over 13,000, which probably makes it the highest emitting facility in the state of Washington. So 2016, we have the UW getting involved, starting to look at a study that was out of LAX. I'll let Elena explain a lot of this. And their findings were extremely interesting because this had been a subject for me and my investigation. I'm kind of like, felt like an investigator looking for treasure in an archaeological dig. I felt like I was a kid in a candy store. I was so excited about this information. And this has blown the lid off of the investigation process, not just for our UW, but institutions all over the country are investigating these various issues here. And as part of the Move Up study group, I asked the question of what is the health of the people under this plume? And again, you find incidents of health impacts that are statistically significant that are also can be related back to that first look in 1998 by the State Department of Health. Here we have King County Department of Health, but these things are well known as related to emissions and noise. So noise is additive, of course, and I won't go into noise because there's plenty of internet information on noise. Here's what some of the noise effects are on health, as well as pollution on children's health. This is the document from EPA that shows the comparison of what the Port of Seattle is reporting for their aircraft engines and what EPA is reporting in yellow is the truth. So this was from 2014. You can see that the airport is very much downplaying what their impacts are. I have asked for reconciliation of these discrepancies and I've not heard back from anybody. If anybody's interested in research, here's some compelling questions that I've written up. What are the actual current rates of emissions around the airport and what are they? And what are their effects on health? And how is that worsened by the synergistic combined effects of noise? So you don't just have emissions affecting your health, you also have noise, and these are all impacting your immune response. Knowing the health status of the communities around the airport is already poor, which we learned from the King County Health Study in 2020. Why are there still huge efforts to move more expansion into SeaTac Airport? The talk has been that they want to double operations. So you've got an aircraft going over every minute. Imagine that happening every 30 seconds. What are the risks related to the toxic air pollutants that we're being exposed to on a 24-hour everyday basis? And what are some mitigations for these risks? And are they enough? Will the airport ever do the follow-up studies, the State Board of Health long-term air toxic sampling, the more thorough follow-up to 91 analysis, and the risk assessment? When will these be done? And so this is the copy of the response on doing a risk assessment in 1996. Now, mind you, we had health problems that were going on in 1993 when we did the air toxic study. We validated a huge environmental impact with the third runway with too low of emission data and false information. Now we have health problems that are very profound. They're in a 10-mile area and they're the worst in the county collectively. And this is an area where 673,000 people are being impacted. So if we'd have done the studies that we should have done back when they were recommended by not just King County and Puget Sound Clean Air, but by the State of Washington Board of Health, we might not be in the situation we are today with all the health impacts. Here's a breakdown of all of the emissions that EPA gathered from the model for 2017. So any questions or ideas? Are you interested in looking into some of these mysteries, like the relationship between these high level of pollutants and the causation of the health effects? What's the relationship of those? That's the big question right now. We know the emissions are bad. We know the people are sick. How do we connect those and protect public health? No comment. Okay. I love
My name is Austin. I'm a professor at the University of Washington. Thanks. And I've had the pleasure of working with Debbie, with Kent, with a whole group of people really passionate about this issue of air pollution and impacts on airport communities. And when I came into this project, I had an expertise in air pollution and exposure assessment. I had never really considered aircraft and airplanes as a source of air pollution. And I'm not the only one. Many people in my field are very focused, rightfully so, on cars, on trucks, on point sources as major contributors to air quality concerns, and they are. But as I've become involved, as I've become involved in this project, I've learned that not only do aircraft contribute to air quality concerns within up to 10 miles of the airport, especially along the flight path, so along the direction of the flights as they come in or depart from the airport. They're also the type of air pollution that's contributed by those aircraft. Mixtures of pollutants are quite different than roadway vehicles and diesel trucks. And that was one of the first things that we tried to investigate with our Move Up study that Debbie mentioned in 2016, was if we measured detailed information on air quality using actually a car. So we had a whole suite of pollutant monitors in a car, and we were driving around north and south of the airport. And the question was, could we actually distinguish between roadway traffic, truck traffic, and aircraft? And when we started that study, many researchers, many people at the port thought the answer was no. And actually what we showed was, in fact, the answer is yes, we can distinguish. And not only can we distinguish between those sources of air pollution, but as you get closer to those flight paths, the contributions from aircraft dominate in those areas, and they dominate in these very tiny ultrafine particles. So what I brought today to show you is one of our ultrafine particle monitors. And so this was one of the instruments that we had in our vehicle as we were driving around. We had others that actually allowed us to look at the size of these particles. This particular instrument is just counting the number of particles. In this building, actually, we have quite good air quality, quite good filtration, which is great. We have about 2,000 particles per cubic centimeter of air. So you can imagine a cubic centimeter, it's a tiny little cube in space. So right here in this room, we have about 2,000 of these ultrafine particles in the air. When we go outside in a typical urban area, maybe not right here, but in a typical urban area, we'll get up to 4,000 particles per cc. As we go close to aircraft landing paths, we can get upwards of 100 or 150,000 per cc. So we're talking a very large increase in the concentration of these ultra-fine particles. It's okay. ultra-fine particles in the environment. And this is not unique to aircraft. If you go near a diesel truck, you'll also find, or a roadway, you'll also find an increase in ultra-fine particles. But again, with our study where we did the mobile monitoring, what we showed was that the ultrafine particles from the aircraft were actually smaller in diameter than the ones from diesel traffic. And when I'm saying smaller, we're talking about 10 nanometers in diameter, which if you could picture your typical width of your hair, that's approximately 1,000 particles across the width of a human hair. So they're very, very tiny. And a concern is that because they are so small, they can actually enter into the body directly and translocate or move through the organ systems of the body, into the brain, into the placenta of a developing fetus, and into other critical organs. Oh, sorry, we're having some AV issues here. Okay. So I'll probably walk through this a little bit. So, one of the questions for researchers has been, health-wise, is it more toxic for people to be exposed to these tiny 10 nanometer particles than other sizes of particles, right? It's a very difficult question to answer right now. Why is that? One of my colleagues likes to say, you only see the things at night that you shine a light onto. And so right now in the United States, we have networks operated by the EPA that measure a whole slew of pollutants. Debbie mentioned them, the criteria air pollutants. And they include particles. They include particles called PM 2.5. There's particles that have a diameter of 2.5 micrometers or less. But these particular particles, PM 2.5, are enormous compared to these ultrafine particles we're talking about. So in these monitoring networks, we're not actually measuring ultrafine particles. And because of that, it's very difficult in a study, for example, looking at hospital admissions over time, to know what the exposure is of individuals who are experiencing health outcomes. And so because we don't measure these ultrafine particles in a systematic way, we don't have a good sense of their distribution and their concentration in space. All right, I'll try and go quickly through the slides that I had. So outdoor air pollution is a concern across the country, not only and across the world, and not only for airport communities. And there are multiple sources of outdoor air pollution. It can include cars and trucks, diesel exhaust. It can include operations within a city. You can think dry cleaning or auto body shop repair locations that might have VOC emissions. They're what we could think of as natural sources, sometimes exacerbated by climate change, for example, wildfires or volcanic eruptions. And we can have things that are area sources. So, for example, farm operations. So it's not one specific location, but it might be a region that generates air pollution because of farming activity or other types of activities. And then you could have what you typically think of, I think, right, when you think of air pollution, which is like a big smokestack with stuff coming out the top of it. And those are thought of as stationary sources. All of these sources in the US are regulated except for airplanes. So airplanes don't have a regulatory framework to try and reduce the emissions that are coming out of that tailpipe. Although there's been some discussions of doing that. So what are some health impacts of air pollutants that we do know of? On the short-term side includes eye irritation, respiratory tract infections or irritations, heart attacks. So for individuals who have heart disease, if they go out and exercise on days where there's high air pollution, it can actually trigger, unfortunately, a heart attack. And it's also been shown to affect short-term cognitive performance. And they actually do that, they put people in chambers, they expose them to air pollution, and they can see a decrease in their cognitive performance before and after the exposure. It's also shown to have long-term health consequences. And so what do we mean by long-term? If you track people over time and capture what their exposure is at their home over a 10-year period, you can see that individuals that have higher exposures to something like PM 2.5, which I mentioned before, which is a particle with a diameter of 2.5 micrometers or lower, those individuals can have increased mortality, heart disease, strokes, increased asthma rates in children, increased development of asthma. And also there's a need to better understand for those communities that are kind of repeatedly exposed over long periods of time to air pollution, how that might impact them during extreme events like a wildfire, right? So I mentioned that we only see what we shine a light onto. And so a lot of the research that has been done leverages these long-term measurements that happen on really an hourly basis at about 750 monitoring locations across the United States. And those locations monitor 6 criteria air pollutants. So PM 2.5, there's some gaseous pollutants, ozone, lead. And because we have these long-term measurements, we can then look at exposures in communities or for individuals and see how it's impacting their health. So we can see the increase in heart attacks and increase in other adverse outcomes. Oops. All right, the EPA then returns that information to the community. And so I don't know if any of you have ever looked up, has anyone ever looked up the air quality index? Okay, we have Woody in the back, we have someone here, Debbie, good. You should be able to get on your phone. So right now, if you have a weather app, in addition to the temperature, you should be able to see the air quality index. And it's a fairly simple index to understand. It ranges from green to maroon. And in situations where it's green, that represents an air quality that's considered good, which means no one has to make any modifications to their daily activities. If it's yellow, so that would be an acceptable air quality. It's actually slightly below what's considered a safe level. There may be some people who are vulnerable to air pollution who may want to reduce their activities outdoors. Who do you think might be vulnerable to air pollution or like more susceptible to air pollution? Okay, I heard children, people with asthma. Yeah, people with asthma. Anyone else? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So people who are reactive to pollen or other components of the air. So those individuals may want to stay inside or take some, modify some activities. Then when we get to orange, so 101 to 150, those individuals who are sensitive may actually start to experience health effects. So they may actually start, if they have asthma, using their medication more, or they may experience chest tightness. And then once we get to red, this is a situation where the air quality is unhealthy, and everyone might consider changing or modifying their daily activities. So I guess as sort of a public service, this is information that is really good to share with your family, with your friends, especially as you go into periods of time where there might be increase of outdoor air pollution. Does anyone know what periods of time there might be poor air quality? Summertime, yeah. So summertime, because of what? Yeah. Why in summer? Yeah, so when there's forest fires, you can often see it, right? Like that haze. So I heard something here. Yeah, so there can be periods of time where it's very warm and there's actually an inversion. So there's like a cap on the atmosphere and we get more air pollution at ground level. That can happen in winter as well with wood burning. So in our area, we have a lot of wood burning, a lot of air quality issues. All right. So I don't have a ton of time left, but so all of these sources, and we haven't even gotten to the airport yet, right? All of these sources contribute to the long-term air pollution levels in our communities. And this is a map that I encourage you to seek out. It's called the Environmental Health Disparities Map. It was put together by the Department of Health in Washington State. And this website allows you to investigate over the entire state 2 things. One is how does the environment in a particular location compare to other areas in the state of Washington? And the environment includes air quality, includes water quality, includes landfill sites and hazardous waste sites. but it also looks at the vulnerability of a particular population. So it looks where there are individuals who have asthma, who have heart disease, who are very young or elderly. And it gives a ranking comparing all the different census tracts in the state to each other. And one of the things I want you to know here is that in particular, South King County and the areas around the airport have very high impacts of environmental health disparities. So they tend to rank in the highest level for both environmental impacts and also sensitive populations as compared to the entire state. And that's getting to some of Debbie's presentation, that there are these impacts that seem to be happening in proximity to the airport that are causing health concerns. And there are also emissions that are happening in proximity to the airport that are increasing the exposure of the individuals living in these areas. I don't have much time left, but I think what I'll start to talk about a little bit, talk about this, is to just touch back to the study that was done by the King County Public Health that was trying to understand what the health of the airport communities, how it compared to other areas of King County. And so what the study did was it divided King County into these circular regions that you can see represented here. So each circle is one region. The inner circle is 1 mile radius from the SeaTac Airport. The middle circle is a 5 mile radius, and the outer circle is a 10-mile radius. And the study started by reviewing airport-related pollutants and their likely health effects. And as I mentioned before, it was found that there were probably respiratory problems, cardiovascular issues, nervous system issues, metabolic issues, and reproductive health concerns that were linked directly to the pollutants that were emitted from aircrafts. The study also looked at who was living within this region and compared the percentage of different racial and ethnic groups within that 10-mile radius to the whole of King County. And so a huge percentage of Native, Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, Black and African American, and Hispanic and Latino individuals that live in King County are represented within this 10-mile radius. Compared to the rest of the county, the people in these airport communities face disparities in health, disparities in health risk factors, so things that might predispose individuals to have health conditions down the road, and resources, so access to health insurance, for example. And for some of the measures that were looked at, the health outcome worsened as you got closer and closer to the airport, so within those radiuses. And those outcomes included hospitalization rates for heart disease, death from all causes, so the mortality rates, and the rates of death from heart disease. And in fact, what was shown is that the life expectancy in the airport communities was 2 to 5 years lower than in the rest of King County. And again, that life expectancy decreased as individuals lived closer to the airport. So I'm going to leave this here. I guess I'll leave this for you to think about. The next question that we're trying to think about is, what about indoor exposures, right? If we know there are these sources of outdoor exposures outdoors, what can be done indoors to prevent those outdoor exposures from impacting people as much? And as a sneak preview, we're doing a study with asthmatic individuals, asthmatic children who live in this 10-mile radius, where we're actually trying to do an intervention with a HEPA filter in their home to decrease the exposure that they might have to air pollutants and measure if there's a benefit or a measurable difference in their indoor air quality and in their asthma symptoms. So thank you. Sorry we ran out of time, but you guys have been a great audience. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Well, I'm gonna wrap things up. one of the things that I really want to encourage you guys to do, that I think this opens a lot of research. There we go. Noise. And with that, see this presentation. When I got out, tried to start doing things, and more people involved, it's very empowering. And I didn't feel like and so I want to guys involved too. And contact as well, trying to get more highlight